What's up guys, Thorn here, and I'm sorry that I have to make this announcement, but my WWE 2k20 Let's Play is now officially cancelled. I do not say this because I wasn't having fun with the game. When the game works, it's fun to play, even with all the bugs. However, the performance I am getting with this game's frame rate is absolutely abysmal. Take a look at this gameplay footage I had already recorded. I have not edited this footage. This is literally how the raw gameplay footage came out, fresh out of OBS Studio. I did everything I could think of to get this game to perform better. Eventually, I just contacted 2K support and asked them for help. I told them my system specs, and the response they gave me was absolutely baffling. They said that I needed DDR4 memory in order to play this game smoothly. Now, I want you all to look at the recommended system requirements on this game's Steam page. As you can clearly see, these official recommended system requirements state that I am able to play this game with a reasonable performance on DDR3 memory. Oh, what's that? You don't see the part where it explicitly specifies DDR3 memory? You can see where it says 8 GB of RAM, but you don't see where it specifies a DDR number? Okay, let me underline it for you. There, do you see it now? Here, let me explain. The short version is that the AMD FX 8350 processor only supports DDR3 memory, which means that if this processor is listed in the recommended specs, that means that DDR3 memory necessarily is also part of the recommended specs. That was the short version. Here's the long version. The AMD FX 83 processor utilizes what is known as an AM3 Plus CPU socket. That means that motherboards I can use this processor on are going to have an AM3 Plus CPU socket, otherwise the processor won't fit. So basically what 2K technical support is saying is that I need a motherboard that has both an AM3 Plus CPU socket and support for DDR4 memory. Well, guess what? Motherboards like that don't exist. Here, as you can see, I am on Newegg.com shopping for motherboards. As I filter their inventory so that only motherboards with an AM3 Plus CPU socket are listed, the option to further filter the motherboards by those with support for DDR4 memory goes away. Meanwhile, if I go back and filter the motherboards by those with support for DDR4 memory, the option to further filter the motherboards by those with AM3 Plus CPU sockets is now gone. The simple explanation for this is that there are no motherboards in existence that have support for both AM3 Plus processors and DDR4 memory. In fact, not only are there no motherboards on the market like that, but they literally physically cannot exist. There are no converters you can buy that can enable you to have DDR4 memory on a DDR3 motherboard. There are no converters you can buy that can enable you to place an AMD FX 8350 processor into a motherboard designed for an AMD Ryzen processor. Technologically speaking, such conversion is simply not possible. So yeah, when the game advertised its recommended system requirements to include an AMD FX 8350 processor, that means they were advertising that I could get reasonable performance with DDR3 memory, because the processor necessarily uses that memory type. Indeed, I can get very close to 60 frames per second in this game when I'm using the benchmark. As you can see from this screenshot, the benchmark returns a solid A grade on my system. However, that does not save 2K from false advertising in this case. I did not buy this game for its benchmark. 2K did not market the benchmark. I cannot even play the benchmark mode for this game. The benchmark is not the part of the game that actually matters. In addition, the fact that the benchmark performs so consistently well is circumstantial evidence that 2K and developer Visual Concepts had gone out of their way to optimize the benchmark while purposefully not optimizing any other portion of the game. In other words, this is not merely a mistake on their part. They intentionally misrepresented the system requirements for this game in full knowledge of the dishonesty of their actions. Now, some of you may argue that recommended system requirements and reasonable performance are both highly subjective terms. 2K is not committing false advertising because there is no objective definition of reasonable performance. You're only getting 4 frames per second, well, that's reasonable performance right there. However, I beg to differ. The industry standard in 2019 is 60 frames per second. Therefore, unless I am explicitly told otherwise, I believe I have the right to assume that 60 frames per second is the definition of reasonable performance. Back in 1999, the industry standard may have been 30 frames per second, or more specifically, 29.97 frames per second, but at no point in human history has 4 to 5 frames per second been considered reasonable performance. Even since the beginning of television, the industry standard has consistently had frame rates in the double digits. But okay, let's give 2K the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that they are indeed authorized by law to decide on their own definition of reasonable performance and set their recommended system requirements accordingly. Well, they've already went and stuck their foot in their mouths in 2 different ways. First, the 2K technical support representative has already admitted that I am not getting reasonable performance from this game. So whatever their definition of reasonable performance may be, they admit I cannot get it with the game's official system requirements. Second, as I mentioned before, I can get an A grade with this game's benchmark tool. The benchmark tool appears to use the same grading system that is used in public schools in the USA, which means that they cannot just make up their own arbitrary standards. They are borrowing from someone else's pre-existing standards. Hell, if anything, the benchmark just makes the situation worse, because I have the right to assume that the benchmark mode is a good indicator of my performance in the rest of the game, so I can get consistently good performance in the benchmark mode. All that really does is lull me into a false sense of security. In fact, the fact that I can consistently get good performance in the benchmark is actually very damning on 2K's end, because as I pointed out earlier, this provides circumstantial evidence that the game's programmers actually optimized the game's benchmark mode, but made the conscious choice not to perform those same optimizations for the other parts of the game that actually matter. Now, while that evidence is, admittedly, circumstantial, if the fact ends up being true, then it becomes very damning to 2K, because at that point they can no longer claim plausible deniability. At that point, they no longer just made a boo-boo when it came to deciding what the system requirements are going to be. At this point, they go from incompetent to completely malicious. They knew full well that the official system requirements were not going to produce good performance, whether good performance is defined by industry standard or their own definition of good performance. But they made the conscious choice to publish those official system requirements any damn way, and they did just enough work to cover their tracks that consumers hopefully would play the game for more than 2 hours before realizing the truth about the game, thereby losing their opportunity to get a refund from Steam for this game. At that point, 2K simply committed a blatant, intentional, and malicious act of false advertising, and there is no 2 ways about it. So I am about to contact 2K's legal division. First, I'm going to opt out of their binding arbitration and class action waiver section of their end-user license agreement. Yes, believe it or not, their EULA does give customers the option to do that. Then I'm going to follow the EULA's guidelines for submitting a legal dispute to them, which doesn't have an opt-out clause in it. Unfortunately for my loving fans, this means that I cannot continue the Let's Play that I literally spent 2/3 of the month of October building up. Please forgive me, it wasn't my fault. Blame 2K for falsely advertising what kind of PC I can play this on. So, until next time, I bid you all adieu. Acer Thorn out. Peace!